It's Monday, July 21st. We have two main risk areas for severe weather today. One is going to be up here in the northern plains, and our other one is going to be down here in the southeast, which also stretches up into parts of the Ohio River Valley. Our main risk area is going to be a slight risk up here in parts of eastern Montana. Then it's going to have an associated marginal risk of severe weather, which stretches all the way down into parts of central and western Nebraska. And our other risk area is also going to be a marginal risk down here. And today's threat is mostly expected to be wind driven, with our main corridor for some damaging winds up here in Montana, which could be anywhere above 65 miles an hour. So definitely some damaging gusts up there. And then we have two conditional risk of damaging winds, which is going to be highlighted by both of our 5% risk areas, which cover both those same areas that our marginal risk of severe weather do. Now, something to note about our northern plains risk area is that I do think our risk of wind could be pretty much expanded to our entire risk area up here, except the certainty about where storms will be and where the strength level of these storms is currently somewhat uncertain. And our hail risk is also going to be in that same corridor up here in Montana, with the possibility of some 2 to 3 inch hail. So definitely some large hail. And that conditional threat spans the rest of our marginal risk area. Now, I do agree that the highest risk of hail is where it is currently highlighted in Montana, but I do think this could be expanded quite a bit into the rest of our risk area today, except it's pretty much the same situation with our wind threat about the uncertainty of these storms being somewhat low. And our flood risk today is going to be centered on parts of the Midwest and Ohio River Valley. We have a slight risk down here specifically, which spans most of Kentucky and even parts of northern Tennessee, where we could see some areas receiving 2 to 4 inches of rainfall. Then we have a marginal risk, which spans all the way down into the southeast. There could be anywhere between 1 to 2 inches of rainfall within that. Then we have another marginal risk, which spans pretty much the entirety of the upper Great Plains and most of the northern plains, and pretty much the same thing goes as our southeastern risk with that 1 to 2 inches of conditional rainfall. And here's a look at our corridor of some very high rain amounts out here in the Ohio River Valley. We can see that a lot of this is going to come pretty early this morning, and we could see some corridors receiving anywhere between 2 to 4 inches, with those 4 inches being more isolated and that 2 to 3 inches of rain being more widespread. And another area which has caught my interest, which I think we could possibly have upgraded as we go further into today, is an area up here in the northern plains where it looks like there's going to be some pretty widespread areas receiving anywhere between 3 to 4 inches of rain today, stretching all the way from North Dakota into Minnesota. And it looks like this would come during mostly the afternoon hours. And our heat wave continues to persist across much of the United States, specifically the southeast Mississippi River Valley, and even into parts of the Great Plains, where it looks like we're going to have some feels like temperatures in the high 100s today out here in the southeast, specifically in parts of the Carolinas. And in the afternoon, that threat of some very hot feels like temperatures will definitely be elevated out here in parts of the Mississippi River Valley and Great Plains, where we could see anywhere between the low to mid 100s. And then we have some great news about our area of tropical development. Yesterday, it had a 20% probability of forming, and now it has been downgraded to a 10% chance. So definitely the likelihood of this forming is looking very slim. So definitely good news for our Caribbean islands. Now here's a look at our main risk area, and we can see that the ingredients are going to start to get laid out by yesterday's storms. It looks like they're going to persist all the way into the morning hours today, and they're just going to be riding an area of some flow from our trough, and it looks like they could possibly redevelop back in the morning hours, and it looks like we could get some storms along the outflow boundary left behind by this, which would also ride that flow from our trough, and it looks like it would also possibly be initiated by a bit of a short wave. And because this would be likely along an outflow boundary, I think that the threat of a spin-up tornado wouldn't be zero, but the main threat with this would be some possibly sizable hail over 1.5 inches and mostly damaging winds. And the same would go from our cluster, which will push all the way down into parts of Minnesota. Now, our afternoon storms are going to be fueled by a couple of things. One is going to be an outflow boundary left behind by our cluster storms, which pushed back into Minnesota earlier in the day, for some potentially strong storms back down here in parts of South Dakota and Nebraska. I do think the threats of all hazards of severe weather could be in play with these, because they will likely be attached to outflow boundary. So some hail, possibly large, some damaging gusts, and the possibility of a spin-up tornado. Then our main risk of severe weather is going to be back here in parts of Montana. And it looks like this is going to be fueled by a trough pushing in and then a dry line, so some frontal activity on top of that. And that's going to bring some organizational shear to these storms, which could allow for them to bring some large hail to the region. Now, what looks like has been trending is the probability of a more linear mode instead of a more clustered discrete mode, so that threat of hail could be lowered, but it looks like the main threat with these storms would be some damaging winds, and they'd be initiated in the mid to late afternoon hours and then push all the way into the evening and continue to bring some damaging gusts to this region. And then anywhere in the Dakotas should be on the lookout for some potential areas of some thunderstorms kicked up by outflow tonight, which could have the possibility of also becoming severe. But somewhere that looks very interesting, which we will definitely see how it develops as we go further in tomorrow, is an area which looks like it could develop along some flow and some boundaries, mostly outflow driven in the very early morning hours on Tuesday or tonight, which looks like it could bring quite a bit of rain to the region and some severe characteristics. And our second risk area is going to be back here in parts of the mid-Atlantic or southeast, and this is going to be initiated by some similar stuff that we've seen the past couple of days, some flow with a trough, some boundaries which stretch across the region with some embedded low pressure systems within them. And what's going to happen is that it's just going to be a moist and unstable environment, so that's going to bring the conditional threat for some damaging gusts around 60 miles an hour. Now, the main driver of our storms is going to be this trough digging in across the Pacific Northwest, and it looks like it's going to eject over the region this afternoon, which will help to initiate those storms and bring some very favorable shear for the organization, and possibly even some low-level shear, which would fuel that threat for some weak tornadoes, although that's very conditional and will mostly rely on the fact of where those outflow boundaries will be and if those storms can cling on to those outflow boundaries. Another thing to note is that we will have a couple of short waves pushing through the region before that, which could help to possibly fuel some of our storm clusters from the morning hours, which will push into Minnesota from the Dakotas. And something we'll notice is that we have very little forcing down here in much of the central plains. It would mostly be entirely from a dry line, so that's why that threat is quite a bit more conditional down there. Then we also see a very large ridge digging in over the U.S., which will help to bring some of that organizational shear and also help to pinch some of this flow, further enhancing it. And then our last area is going to be this area down here in the mid-Atlantic, where we're going to have some downslope flow or northwesterly flow across the region, which could be a reason for those storms to be forced up. And here's a general look of what the environment is going to look like in the northern plains. We have a very little curve in our photograph, and then it straightens out quite a bit. Now, if storms were to be along an outflow boundary, we would see an increase in this curve and some more favorable shear, which could support that tornado threat. But mostly on areas that are not along the outflow boundary, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be an environment with quite a bit of organizational shear and some wind veering, which will feel that threat for some strong updrafts and some large hail, and mostly just organized storms, which last longer. We also have quite a bit of cape up here near our freezing level. Then our mid-level lapse rates are going to be quite good at 8.6 southeast decreasing per kilometer. So definitely the reason for some large hail, possibly even up to 2 to 3 inches today. We also have some very high low-level lapse rates and some dry air loft, which would support that threat for some damaging winds. And most of all, we have a moist environment coupled with a very unstable environment at around 4,000 cape. So very conducive for severe weather up here in the northern plains. And in areas which aren't going to be along our outflow boundary, or where we're going to see some more high base storms, which means that tornado threat with them would be close to zero, but areas along the outflow boundary could see this lowered, and that is why that tornado threat could be realized along storms with our outflow boundaries. Then our precipitable water isn't going to be super high, but our relative humidity is going to be pretty low, which could increase the cold pooling and evaporative cooling, which could also support that threat for some damaging winds out here. So mainly in the northern plains with storms not attached to our outflow boundaries, they're just going to be high-based, large hail, and some isolated severe gust producers. But with storms along our outflow boundaries is where we could see that all hazards risk, so possibly the threat of a spin-up tornado. And here's a weather sounding from our southeastern mid-Atlantic area. Our photograph and our shear don't really look that interesting, but it's going to be the same as the past couple of days, where we have a very moist environment coupled with a fairly unstable environment at around 3,000 cape. Then our precipitable water is going to be high, which could fuel that threat of some flooding and stronger downdrafts also, which could mean some more severe gusts than a pretty high 3 cape, so which would also fuel that general threat for severe weather. So mostly the damaging wind risk is going to be what's happening down here in the southeast.